Ma'am, the VIP floor is upstairs. Deliveries go around back. The words landed with the casual confidence of someone who had said them 100 times before and never once been questioned. Ava Richardson stopped walking. For a moment, the polished marble lobby seemed to hold its breath. The revolving doors whispered shut behind her, sealing out the cool October air of downtown Charlotte. Morning sunlight spilled through the 40-foot glass facade, scattering reflections across the floor like sheets of liquid gold. Around her, customers moved through the bank's grand atrium carrying leather briefcases and takeaway coffee cups. No one looked twice at the middle-aged black woman standing near the reception desk with a simple navy coat, sensible shoes, and a weathered wooden box tucked carefully beneath one arm. Ava lowered her eyes briefly to the box. Her fingers brushed the brass latch worn smooth by decades of use. Then she looked back up. "I'm not making a delivery," she said politely. The receptionist offered a smile that never reached her eyes. "Of course. Well, if you're here for customer service, there's a waiting area near the entrance." Ava glanced toward the rows of plastic chairs beside the front doors. She had spent enough years in classrooms to recognize dismissal disguised as courtesy. Still, she nodded. "I actually have an appointment." The receptionist's smile tightened. "With whom?" Ava reached into her coat pocket and unfolded a small cream-colored card. "The executive office." The receptionist barely glanced at it before giving a soft laugh. "The executive office?" Nearby, a security guard shifted his stance. A young banker standing at a kiosk looked over with open curiosity. Ava could feel the attention gathering around her like static electricity before a storm. "Yes," she answered. "I was instructed to come this morning." The receptionist finally took the card. Her expression changed slightly as she read the embossed lettering, though only for a second. Then her face settled back into practiced confidence. "There must be some misunderstanding." Ava remained calm. "I don't believe there is." The receptionist slid the card across the counter. "The executive floor handles major institutional matters. Family trusts, corporate accounts, that sort of thing." Ava nodded once. "That's correct." A faint chuckle came from behind her. Someone waiting in line shook his head. Another customer glanced toward the wooden box and smirked. The receptionist leaned forward slightly. "Ma'am, perhaps you should explain exactly why you're here." Ava's grip tightened around the box. The scent of furniture polish drifted through the lobby. Somewhere above them, an elevator chimed. She remembered her grandmother's voice from years ago. "Never argue with people who have already decided who you are. Let time do the talking." "I'm here to deliver something," Ava said quietly. "Something that belongs to this bank." "Then it is a delivery." The receptionist smiled triumphantly. "Like I said, deliveries go around back." A few people nearby laughed softly. Not cruelly, not loudly, just enough to make the distance between Ava and everyone else feel wider than the 100 feet separating the entrance from the elevators. Ava looked toward those elevators now. For polished silver doors stood beneath a massive wall displaying the institution's history. Photographs of founders, former chairmen, historic buildings, generations of leadership stretching back more than a century. Her eyes lingered on one black and white portrait before returning to the receptionist. "I was told to bring this personally," she said. The receptionist sighed. "And who exactly told you that?" Ava opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, a new voice cut across the lobby. Sharp, confident, accustomed to obedience. What seems to be the problem here? Conversations slowed. Heads turned. Richard Coleman, regional bank manager, strode across the marble floor with measured steps, adjusting the cuff of his tailored charcoal suit. The receptionist visibly relaxed. The security guard straightened, and Ava, still holding the old wooden box against her chest, watched as the man approached, completely unaware that the object he was dismissing had been waiting 40 years to return to this building. Richard Coleman stopped 3 feet from the reception desk and surveyed the scene with the practiced expression of a man who believed every room belonged to him the moment he entered it. His polished shoes clicked softly against the marble floor. The silver nameplate on his tailored suit caught the morning light. Around the lobby, conversations faded into curious silence. The receptionist immediately straightened. "Good morning, Mr. Coleman." Richard barely acknowledged her. His attention had already settled on Ava. More specifically, on the worn wooden box she carried. His eyes moved from the scuffed corners of the box to her simple coat and practical shoes. Then they returned to her face. "I understand there is some confusion," he said. His voice was smooth, controlled, almost pleasant. Ava met his gaze calmly. "I do not believe there is." A faint smile appeared at the corner of Richard's mouth. It was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "I am told you are requesting access to the executive floor. I have an appointment." Richard glanced toward the receptionist. "And do we have a record of that?" The receptionist shook her head. "No, sir." Richard nodded as though that settled the matter. "There you have it." Ava remained still. The wooden box rested against her side. She could feel the cool brass latch beneath her fingertips. "The appointment was arranged several weeks ago," she said. "I was instructed to come today at 10 o'clock. Richard checked his watch. "It is 10:15. A few customers nearby chuckled quietly. Ava ignored them. Traffic was heavier than expected. "That is unfortunate." Richard folded his arms. "But without confirmation, there is nothing more we can do." For a brief moment nobody spoke. The giant clock mounted above the lobby entrance ticked steadily. Somewhere across the room, an espresso machine hissed inside the customer lounge. Ava looked past Richard toward the elevator bank again. The same wall of framed photographs stretched behind him. Generations of executives smiling confidently into history. One particular photograph seemed to draw her attention every time she looked up. Richard noticed her gaze. "Something interesting?" he asked. Ava hesitated. "Just the photographs." Richard turned briefly toward the display. "Our founders." His tone carried unmistakable pride. "A remarkable legacy." Ava nodded slowly. "I imagine it is." Richard looked back at her. "Which is exactly why access to executive operations is restricted." He gestured lightly toward the box. "What exactly is inside?" "A family item." "For whom?" That information was included in the appointment request. The answer irritated him more than outright defiance would have. Ava could see it in the tightening of his jaw. Around them, several customers had openly stopped pretending not to watch. A young financial advisor standing near a brochure display folded his arms and settled in as though waiting for a performance. Richard sighed dramatically. "Ma'am, perhaps we can save everyone some time." His voice carried just enough to reach the surrounding lobby. "If this concerns an inheritance matter, legal paperwork should be submitted through standard channels." Ava said nothing. "If it concerns a family account, customer services can assist." Still nothing. Richard tilted his head slightly. "And if you are here because someone promised you access that does not exist, I am afraid you were misinformed." The receptionist nodded in agreement. Ava lowered her eyes to the box. The dark wood reflected faint streaks of sunlight from the glass wall. Her grandmother had kept it locked for decades. Through moves, illnesses, birthdays, and funerals. Through years when nobody spoke about the bank at all. She remembered the final conversation clearly. The hospital room had smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender lotion. Eleanor Richardson had placed a trembling hand over the box and whispered 5 words. "Take it back when ready." Ava looked up again. "Someone is expecting this." Richard smiled patiently. The way people smile when speaking to someone they believe simply does not understand reality. "Then I assure you," he said, "whoever that person is, they are not waiting upstairs." The words hung in the air for a second. Then a quiet voice suddenly came from behind the reception desk. "Mr. Coleman?" Everyone turned. A junior employee stood frozen beside a computer terminal, staring at something on his screen. The color had drained from his face. "I think you should see this." The silence that followed felt heavier than the marble beneath their feet. Richard Coleman turned toward the young employee, irritation flashing across his face. "What is it, Tyler?" The employee swallowed hard. His fingers hovered above the keyboard as though he was afraid to touch it again. "Sir, I searched the appointment records." Richard let out a slow breath. "And?" Tyler glanced from the screen to Ava, then back to Richard. "There is an appointment." A murmur rippled through the lobby. Richard's expression did not change immediately. But Ava noticed the tiny shift in his posture, the slightest stiffening of his shoulders. "There are thousands of appointments," Richard said calmly. "That proves nothing. This one is marked executive priority." Tyler's voice sounded smaller now. "Priority," Richard repeated. "Who authorized it?" Tyler hesitated. "The chairman's office." The words seemed to hang in the air. Even the receptionist blinked. Richard stared at him for several seconds. "The chairman's office does not schedule appointments through public channels." "I know, sir." Tyler turned the monitor slightly. "That is why I checked twice." Richard stepped behind the desk and looked at the screen himself. Ava could not see what was displayed, but she saw the color slowly drain from his face. Not much, just enough. Around them, customers exchanged curious looks. The young financial advisor near the brochures lowered his arms. The security guard shifted his weight uncomfortably. Richard straightened and forced a smile. There must be an administrative error. Nobody answered. Tyler cleared his throat. "The appointment includes a reference number." Richard extended his hand. "Print it." Tyler obeyed immediately. The printer hummed softly. A single sheet emerged. Richard took it before anyone else could. His eyes scanned the page, then scanned it again. Ava watched him carefully. For the first time since he arrived, he was no longer performing for the room. He was thinking. "Interesting," he said finally. His voice had lost some of its certainty. "Very interesting." Ava remained silent. She had spent years teaching middle school students. She recognized the moment confidence became doubt. Richard folded the paper neatly. "Miss Richardson." It was the first time he had used her name. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." Ava glanced around the lobby. A few minutes earlier, privacy had not seemed important to him. "I am comfortable here," she said. The receptionist looked down at her desk. Tyler suddenly became very interested in his keyboard. Richard forced another smile. "Of course." A long pause followed. Then Ava carefully placed the wooden box on the reception counter. The old brass latch caught the sunlight. Tiny scratches covered the surface. Marks left by decades of handling. Richard looked at it as though seeing it clearly for the first time. "What exactly is in there?" he asked quietly. Ava rested her hand on the lid. "Something my grandmother protected for 40 years. And why bring it now?" Her eyes moved briefly toward the photographs displayed across the lobby wall. "Because she asked me to." Richard followed her gaze. Again she seemed focused on the same black and white portrait. An older gentleman standing beside the bank's original headquarters. Richard frowned slightly. "Did you know him?" Ava looked back at him. "No." "Then why keep staring at that picture?" For the first time all morning, something changed in Ava's expression. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Something closer to memory. "Because my grandmother used to." The answer seemed simple enough. Yet it landed differently. Richard glanced back toward the photograph. The name beneath the frame was partially visible from where they stood. Founder Emeritus. Nathaniel Brooks. One of the men credited with saving the institution during its most difficult years. Richard turned back toward Ava. Before he could speak again, a sharp electronic chime echoed from behind the reception desk. Tyler looked at the monitor and immediately froze. His eyes widened. "Sir," he whispered, "you need to see this." Richard walked over, visibly annoyed. Then he saw the message on the screen. His jaw tightened. Across the top of the notification, stamped in bold executive lettering, were 6 words that instantly changed the atmosphere inside the lobby. "Escort Miss Richardson upstairs immediately." For several seconds nobody moved. The notification remained glowing on the monitor like a spotlight nobody wanted to stand beneath. Richard Coleman stared at the screen. Then he read the message again. "Escort Miss Richardson upstairs immediately." No explanation. No signature. No room number. Just a direct instruction routed through an executive channel that very few employees could access. Behind him, the lobby had become strangely quiet. The receptionist looked down at her desk. The security guard shifted uncomfortably. Even the customers who had been openly watching now seemed unsure where to look. Ava stood exactly where she had been before. One hand rested lightly on the wooden box. Her posture had not changed. Her expression had not changed. Yet somehow the entire room felt different. Richard inhaled slowly and adjusted his tie. It was a small gesture, but Ava noticed it. People often adjusted things when they felt their control slipping. "Miss Richardson," he said carefully, "it appears there has been an update." Ava nodded once. "So I see." Richard forced a polite smile. "If you would follow me." The receptionist blinked. 10 minutes earlier she had been directing Ava toward the waiting area near the entrance. Now the regional manager himself was offering an escort. Ava reached for the wooden box. The brass latch felt cool beneath her fingertips. She lifted it carefully and followed Richard across the lobby. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly through the vast atrium. As they approached the elevators, Ava caught fragments of whispered conversations behind them. Questions, speculation, curiosity. Nobody knew what was happening. Truthfully, neither did she. The silver elevator doors opened with a gentle chime. Richard stepped aside and gestured for her to enter first. Another small change. Ava noticed that too. Inside, the elevator walls reflected muted gold light from recessed fixtures above. The air smelled faintly of cedar and expensive cologne. Richard pressed a black access panel mounted beside the controls. A hidden button illuminated. Floor 32. Executive level. The doors slid shut. Silence settled over the elevator. For several floors neither of them spoke. Ava watched the glowing numbers climb steadily upward. 12. 14. 16. Richard finally cleared his throat. "You mentioned your grandmother." Ava kept her eyes on the display. "Yes. Eleanor Richardson." It was not a question. Ava looked at him. "You know the name?" Richard hesitated. "I have heard it before." The answer sounded incomplete. Ava let it pass. 21. 22. 23. The elevator continued its quiet ascent. Richard glanced toward the wooden box. "What exactly did she tell you?" Ava thought for a moment. "Not much. Nothing. Only that one day this box needed to come back here." Richard frowned. "That is all. She said the bank would understand." The numbers reached 27. Richard looked away. Through the reflection in the polished steel wall, Ava could see uncertainty spreading across his face. Not fear. Not yet. Just confusion. Whatever he thought this morning would be simple had clearly become something else. The elevator slowed as it approached the upper floors. 29. 30. 31. Then finally 32. A soft tone sounded. The doors opened. Ava expected another office floor. Instead she found herself staring into a private reception area unlike anything below. Thick carpets muted every sound. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Charlotte skyline. Original oil paintings lined the walls. Sunlight spilled across dark walnut furniture polished to a mirror finish. The entire space felt less like a workplace and more like a private institution, hidden inside another institution. A woman in a charcoal suit stood waiting near a curved reception desk. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back. The moment she saw Ava, she stepped forward. Not toward Richard. Toward Ava. "Miss Richardson," she said warmly. "Thank goodness you are here." Richard stopped walking. Ava noticed it immediately. So did the woman. She glanced at him briefly before returning her attention to Ava. "We have been expecting you." Then her eyes lowered to the wooden box. For the first time since Ava entered the building, someone looked at it with unmistakable recognition. The woman's expression softened. "After all these years," she whispered. The silver-haired woman extended both hands toward the wooden box but stopped just short of touching it, as though it deserved a level of respect normally reserved for something far more valuable than wood and brass. Ava noticed the faint tremor in her fingers. "My name is Margaret Ellis," the woman said softly. "I have worked for this institution for 37 years. Her eyes remained fixed on the box. "And I honestly never believed I would see that again." Richard Coleman stood several feet away, suddenly looking less like the man who controlled an entire region, and more like someone who had walked into the middle of a conversation already decades in progress. "Margaret," he said carefully, "perhaps someone should explain what is happening." Margaret glanced toward him. The look was polite but brief. "In a moment." Then she turned back to Ava. "Would you come with me?" Ava nodded. Together they walked through a set of walnut doors at the far end of the reception area. Richard followed automatically, though Ava noticed he no longer seemed certain whether he was leading or merely keeping up. Beyond the doors sat a conference room unlike any Ava had ever seen. A single table stretched nearly 20 feet across the center of the room. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Charlotte skyline. Sunlight reflected off distant glass towers. The city looked peaceful from up here. Quiet. Removed from the tension downstairs. Margaret motioned toward a chair. Please. Ava placed the box carefully on the polished table and sat. Margaret remained standing for several seconds, studying it. Finally, she reached into her jacket pocket and removed a small key attached to a faded blue ribbon. The ribbon looked old enough to belong in a museum. Your grandmother gave this to me in 1984, Margaret said. Ava blinked. You knew her. A warm smile crossed Margaret's face. Everyone on this floor knew Eleanor Richardson. Richard frowned. I have never heard that name mentioned in executive records. Margaret looked at him. That is because some stories are not written in annual reports. The room fell silent again. Margaret stepped closer to the box. Your grandmother visited this building exactly once after the agreement was signed. Ava leaned forward slightly. Agreement. Margaret nodded. She carried this box into the boardroom and left with a promise. Richard folded his arms. What promise? Margaret did not answer immediately. Instead, she inserted the old key into the brass lock. The mechanism clicked with surprising ease despite the decades that had passed. Ava felt her heartbeat quicken. Her grandmother had never opened the box in front of her. Not once. Even as a child, Ava had only been told that it mattered. Nothing more. Margaret slowly lifted the lid. Inside lay a single envelope resting on dark velvet. Cream-colored. Thick. Sealed with deep blue wax. The seal bore an emblem Ava had never seen before. Around the envelope sat several yellow documents tied neatly with ribbon. Margaret exhaled softly. It is all still here. Richard stepped closer despite himself. What exactly are we looking at? Margaret carefully lifted the envelope. Her eyes shimmered with emotion. The reason this bank still exists. Nobody spoke. Outside the windows, sunlight glimmered across the city skyline. Inside the conference room, even the hum of the ventilation system seemed distant. Ava stared at the envelope. 40 years. Her grandmother had protected it for 40 years. Who is it addressed to? She asked quietly. Margaret turned the envelope over. The elegant handwriting on the front had faded slightly with age, but the name remained perfectly readable. When Richard saw it, his expression changed instantly. Because the letter was not addressed to a chairman. It was not addressed to a chief executive officer. It was not addressed to the board. The envelope contained only 6 handwritten words. To the family who saved us. Nobody moved for several seconds. The envelope rested in Margaret Ellis's hands as though it carried more weight than paper should. Sunlight poured through the towering windows behind her, illuminating tiny flecks of dust drifting through the air. Ava could hear the faint hum of the city 32 stories below, but inside the conference room everything felt suspended. Richard Coleman stared at the faded handwriting. To the family who saved us. He read the words twice. Then a third time. The confidence that had defined him all morning seemed to retreat a little farther with every passing second. Saved us from what? He finally asked. Margaret looked at him carefully. Collapse. The answer landed softly, but it changed the atmosphere of the room. Richard blinked. That is impossible. Margaret gave a faint smile. Most people working here today do not know the story. Ava remained silent. Her eyes never left the envelope. Growing up, her grandmother had never spoken about wealth, never spoke about influence, never talked about powerful people. Eleanor Richardson taught Sunday school, volunteered at food drives, and spent her evenings reading on a creaking front porch swing. Nothing about her suggested hidden history. Yet sitting here now, Ava felt as though she was meeting her grandmother for the first time. Margaret carefully broke the aging wax seal. The sound was barely audible, but it seemed to echo through the room. She unfolded the letter slowly. The paper had yellowed with age, though the handwriting remained remarkably clear. Margaret's eyes scanned the first few lines. Almost immediately her expression changed. Not surprise. Recognition. I remember this, she whispered. Richard stepped closer. You have read it before? Once. Margaret nodded. 40 years ago. Ava leaned forward slightly. What does it say? Margaret looked at her. I think your grandmother wanted you to hear it exactly as it was written. She adjusted her glasses and began reading aloud. To the Richardson family. If you are reading this letter, then our agreement has been honored. The box has been protected. The promise has been kept. And this institution has survived long enough to repay a debt that can never truly be repaid. Richard slowly lowered himself into a chair. Margaret continued. There may come a day when nobody remembers what happened in 1984. There may come a day when annual reports replace gratitude and success replaces humility. If that day arrives, let this letter serve as a reminder that there would be no institution left to celebrate had it not been for one family who chose compassion over opportunity. Ava felt a chill move through her chest. Compassion over opportunity. Those words sounded exactly like something her grandmother would say. Margaret continued reading. When others saw failure, they saw people. When others protected themselves, they protected employees. When others calculated profit, they calculated consequences. Richard stared at the tabletop. His reflection shimmered faintly in the polished wood. What happened in 1984? Ava asked quietly. Margaret lowered the letter. For a moment she seemed unsure where to begin. Then she looked toward the skyline beyond the windows. The bank was 6 weeks from disappearing. Silence returned. Ava watched Richard's head slowly lift. Margaret folded the letter carefully. And what happened next, she said softly, is something the board has spent 40 years trying to honor. Margaret Ellis rested the folded letter on the table with extraordinary care. Nobody reached for it. Nobody interrupted. The room seemed filled with the weight of people who were no longer there. Outside the windows, traffic moved through the city below in tiny streams of sunlight and steel, unaware that a forgotten chapter of history was quietly unfolding 32 floors above. Ava sat motionless. Her grandmother's face drifted through her memory. Eleanor Richardson watering flowers before sunrise. Eleanor Richardson carrying grocery bags for neighbors twice her size. Eleanor Richardson smiling whenever someone thanked her and changing the subject before they could praise her for too long. None of those memories matched the image beginning to emerge here. Richard Coleman leaned forward slightly. 6 weeks from disappearing? He asked. How is that possible? Margaret folded her hands. Because institutions are not as permanent as people think. She looked toward the envelope again. Back then this bank expanded too quickly. Several investments failed at the same time. Depositors were leaving. Regulators were asking difficult questions. Every week brought another rumor. Richard listened without speaking. Margaret continued. The board believed they could secure emergency financing. They could not. One by one, potential partners walked away. Ava noticed something changing in Margaret's voice. The polished executive tone was gone. What remained sounded personal. Employees were terrified, Margaret said softly. Some had worked here for decades. Some were supporting families. Others were weeks away from retirement. Nobody knew what would happen if the doors closed. Sunlight shifted across the conference table. The brass latch on the wooden box glimmered briefly. Then your grandfather arrived. Ava blinked. My grandfather? Margaret nodded. James Richardson. The name felt unfamiliar in this setting. Ava knew him only through old photographs and stories told around holiday dinners. Quiet man. A church volunteer. A mechanic who loved restoring antique radios in his garage. Nothing about him sounded like someone capable of influencing a major financial institution. What did he do? She asked. Margaret smiled faintly. That is the remarkable part. Richard leaned closer. He invested? No, bought shares. No, Richard frowned. Then how did he save the bank? Margaret's eyes softened. He refused to profit from its failure. Silence settled over the room again. Ava felt her heartbeat quicken. Margaret opened one of the yellowed documents tied with ribbon. The paper crackled softly. Your grandfather owned land the bank desperately needed during a restructuring agreement. Ava listened carefully. Several investors offered him enormous sums to sell elsewhere and let the institution collapse. Richard stared at her. And he turned them down? Margaret nodded. Because he knew thousands of employees would suffer. The room became very quiet. Even the distant sounds of the building seemed to disappear. He accepted a much smaller arrangement, Margaret continued. One that allowed the restructuring to move forward. Richard slowly sat back in his chair. That decision kept the bank alive? Margaret looked directly at him. That decision gave it a future. Ava lowered her eyes. Suddenly she understood why her grandmother had never spoken about wealth or power. This was not a story about either. It was a story about choice. Margaret carefully unfolded another document. Her expression changed the moment she saw the signature at the bottom. Oh my! Ava looked up. What is it? Margaret did not answer immediately. She turned the page toward them. At the bottom sat a row of signatures from long-retired board members. Beneath them, written in bold ink, was a commitment made 4 decades earlier. Richard read the final line aloud before he realized he was doing it. The Richardson family shall always be welcomed as honored partners of this institution. The words hung in the air. Then Margaret quietly revealed the sentence written directly beneath it. A sentence nobody in the room expected to find. And one day, a seat on this board shall be offered to their chosen heir. Ava stared at the sentence for several long seconds. The words seemed impossible to connect to her own life. A seat on this board shall be offered to their chosen heir. She read it again. Then again. Across the table, Richard Coleman looked equally stunned. The polished executive who had questioned her presence downstairs now sat silent, his attention fixed on a promise signed decades before either of them held their current positions. Margaret Ellis carefully lowered the document onto the table. The board renewed that commitment every 10 years, she said quietly. Most members never expected it to be exercised. Ava finally looked up. My grandmother never mentioned any of this. Margaret smiled softly. That sounds exactly like Eleanor. Sunlight drifted across the room, illuminating the faded signatures at the bottom of the page. The ink had aged. The paper had aged. Yet the promise remained. Ava leaned back slightly in her chair. Her thoughts returned to the small brick house where her grandmother had lived for nearly 50 years. The squeak of the porch swing. The smell of cinnamon bread on Sunday mornings. The vegetable garden she refused to stop tending even in her 80s. Nothing about Eleanor Richardson had suggested influence. She never chased recognition, never displayed wealth, never spoke about powerful people. Now Ava understood why. She did not want any of this, did she? Ava asked. Margaret shook her head. She believed gratitude should not become leverage. Richard rubbed a hand across his jaw. Then why preserve the agreement? Margaret looked toward the envelope. Because some promises are bigger than the people who make them. The room grew quiet again. Ava lowered her eyes to the documents spread across the table. For the first time she noticed additional pages beneath the original agreement. Financial reports. Meeting notes. Letters exchanged between board members. Decades of history carefully preserved. Margaret selected one of the folders and slid it across the table. You should see this. Ava opened it slowly. Inside were photographs. Old photographs. Black and white images from the 1980s. Executives standing together outside the original headquarters. Employees celebrating milestones. Community events. Then Ava stopped. One photograph immediately captured her attention. Standing near the center of the frame was a man she recognized instantly. James Richardson. Her grandfather. He was smiling awkwardly, hands in his pockets, dressed in a simple jacket. Around him stood several bank executives. Yet something about the photograph felt strange. Ava looked closer. The executives were not posing around him. They were standing beside him. As equals. Margaret noticed her expression. That photograph was taken the day the restructuring agreement was finalized. Ava traced the edge of the picture carefully with her fingertips. He never told anyone. No, Margaret said. He never did. Richard stared at the photograph. Most people would have built an entire legacy around something like this. Margaret nodded. The Richardsons built a family instead. Those words settled heavily over the room. Ava felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. Not because of wealth. Not because of influence. Because she was beginning to understand the kind of people her grandparents had chosen to be. Margaret reached for another document. There is one more thing you need to know. Ava looked up. Margaret's expression had become serious again. The current board reviewed these records 6 months ago. Richard frowned. Why? Margaret slid a sealed folder toward Ava. Because they were preparing for your arrival. Ava looked at the sealed folder resting on the table between them. The cream-colored cover appeared ordinary at first glance, yet everything that had happened during the past hour suggested otherwise. The room felt quieter now. Not empty. Expectant. As though the building itself had been waiting for this moment longer than anyone currently inside it had been alive. Richard Coleman stared at the folder. Preparing for her arrival, he repeated. Margaret Ellis nodded. The board was informed shortly after Eleanor Richardson passed away. Ava blinked. How would they know that? Margaret offered a small smile. Because your grandmother never completely disappeared from this institution. She simply preferred to stay out of sight. Ava lowered her eyes. That sounded exactly like Eleanor. The woman who donated anonymously. The woman who mailed birthday cards without signing her full name. The woman who somehow remembered every neighbor's favorite pie but never talked about herself. Margaret slid the folder closer. Open it. Ava hesitated before breaking the seal. Inside was a single document printed on heavy paper. The bank's crest appeared at the top. Beneath it sat several signatures. Recent signatures. Current signatures. The chairman. Board members. Senior executives. Names that carried influence throughout the region. Ava's eyes moved to the title. She read it once. Then again. Formal recognition of legacy partnership. Richard leaned forward slightly. What does it say? Ava continued reading silently. Margaret answered instead. 6 months ago, the board voted unanimously to honor the original agreement. Richard looked surprised. Unanimously. Every member. Margaret folded her hands. There was not a single objection. Ava felt something tighten in her chest. Not pride. Not excitement. Something more complicated. Her entire life had been built around ordinary things. Lesson plans. Parent conferences. Grocery lists. Church picnics. She had never imagined herself connected to boardrooms or executive decisions. Yet here she was, holding a document that suggested her family had quietly shaped the future of an institution for decades. There must be some mistake, she said softly. Margaret shook her head. There is no mistake. Ava looked down again. Near the bottom of the page sat another paragraph. This one addressed directly to her. The board acknowledges the values demonstrated by the Richardson family and extends an invitation to continue that legacy in whatever form their chosen heir deems appropriate. Ava stared at the sentence. Continue that legacy. Not inherit wealth. Not claim authority. Continue a legacy. The distinction mattered. Richard seemed to notice it as well. His expression softened for the first time all day. They are not offering power, he said quietly. Margaret nodded. They are offering trust. The sunlight had shifted lower in the sky now. Long golden reflections stretched across the conference table. Ava glanced toward the photograph of her grandfather lying beside the documents. A mechanic. A church volunteer. A man who had chosen people over profit. Suddenly the promise made decades ago felt less mysterious. It felt earned. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. The conference room door opened. A tall man in a dark suit stepped inside. His silver hair was neatly combed. His posture carried the calm confidence of someone accustomed to responsibility. The moment Margaret saw him, she stood. Richard rose immediately afterward. Ava remained seated, unsure what was happening. The man smiled warmly when he saw her. Then his eyes settled on the open box, the letter, and the documents spread across the table. Miss Richardson, he said. I am William Hartley, chairman of the board. He paused briefly before adding the words that made Richard Coleman lower his gaze toward the floor. I came down as soon as I heard how your morning began. The room remained silent after William Hartley spoke. Sunlight reflected softly across the polished conference table. casting long golden streaks through the documents that had remained hidden for decades. Ava studied the chairman carefully. He did not carry himself like someone performing authority. If anything, he seemed genuinely unsettled. His attention shifted briefly toward Richard Coleman before returning to her. "Miss Richardson," he said quietly, "before we discuss anything else, I owe you an apology." Richard lowered his eyes. Margaret Ellis remained still beside the windows. Ava felt the weight of the moment settle over the room. William pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "When I received the alert from Margaret this morning, I reviewed the security footage from the lobby." His voice remained calm. "I watched the entire interaction. Nobody spoke. The distant hum of the city drifted faintly through the thick glass windows." William folded his hands. "What happened downstairs does not reflect the values that built this institution." Richard shifted uncomfortably. Ava noticed it but said nothing. For most of the morning she had imagined confronting someone, explaining herself, defending her presence. Yet now that the truth was unfolding, none of that seemed important anymore. William looked toward the old photograph of James Richardson resting on the table. The reason this bank survived was not money. His finger lightly touched the edge of the frame. "Many people had money. Your grandfather possessed something far rarer." Ava glanced down at the photograph. "Compassion." William nodded. "Exactly." For several seconds the room remained quiet. Then William opened a leather portfolio he had brought with him. Inside sat another document. Newer, cleaner, printed only weeks earlier. He placed it in front of Ava. "This is what the board prepared." Ava looked down. At the top appeared the bank's official crest. Beneath it were the words Legacy Stewardship Initiative. She frowned slightly. "What is this?" William smiled. "Not a board seat." Richard looked surprised. Margaret smiled knowingly. Ava looked between them. "Then what is it?" William leaned back in his chair. 6 months ago the board debated whether honoring the original agreement meant offering a symbolic title. He paused. "Then we realized your grandparents would have hated that idea." A faint laugh escaped Margaret. "Without question." William nodded. "The more we studied their history, the more obvious it became. They never cared about status. They cared about people." Ava felt emotion rising unexpectedly in her chest. That sounded exactly right. William slid the document closer. "So instead of offering power, we created something else." Ava read the first page carefully. Her eyes widened. The initiative would fund financial literacy programs, community development grants, scholarships, and small business support throughout underserved neighborhoods across North Carolina. The program would operate independently from corporate interests. Its mission statement emphasized dignity, opportunity, and service. The final line stopped her completely. Guided by a member of the Richardson family. Ava slowly looked up. William's expression remained steady. The board voted unanimously. Richard stared at the document. Margaret's eyes shimmered with quiet pride. Ava looked back down at the pages. Suddenly she understood why her grandmother had protected the box for 40 years. The promise had never been about wealth. It had never been about influence. It had been waiting for the right moment to become useful again. For a long moment Ava said nothing. The document rested in her hands while sunlight continued its slow journey across the conference table. Outside, the city moved through another ordinary afternoon. Cars crossed intersections. Office workers hurried between buildings. Somewhere a school bell was ringing. Life continued as normal. Yet inside this room everything felt different. Ava looked at the proposal again. Scholarships, community programs, financial education, small business support. None of it felt like a reward. Felt like responsibility. William Hartley seemed to understand exactly what she was thinking. Your grandparents believed opportunity should reach people before crisis does, he said quietly. We found those words in one of Eleanor's letters. Ava smiled faintly. That sounds like her. Margaret nodded. She wrote it after volunteering at a food pantry. Richard Coleman sat silently near the end of the table. The confidence that had filled the lobby earlier was gone now. In its place sat something more honest. Reflection. Ava noticed him looking toward the photograph of James Richardson again. I keep thinking about something, Richard finally said. His voice was lower than before. Your grandfather could have taken the larger offer. Nobody interrupted. Richard looked down at his folded hands. Most people would have. Margaret smiled sadly. That is why most people are not remembered 40 years later. The room became quiet again. Ava carefully returned the proposal to the table. Her fingertips rested on the cover for a second. There is something I do not understand. William leaned forward slightly. What is that? Ava glanced around the room. If the board knew all of this 6 months ago, why wait until now? William exchanged a brief look with Margaret. Then he smiled. Because of your grandmother. Ava blinked. What do you mean? Margaret opened another folder from the box. This one contained a handwritten note. The paper was newer than the others. Not decades old. Recent. Margaret handed it to Ava. The handwriting was immediately familiar. Eleanor Richardson. Ava felt her throat tighten before she even began reading. The note was short. Very short. If you are reading this, then I am gone. Do not rush to fulfill old promises. Give Ava time to remain herself. Let her choose freely. If she comes, welcome her. If she does not, leave her in peace. Ava stared at the words. The room blurred slightly for a moment. Her grandmother had known. Not every detail, but enough. Enough to protect her one final time. William's voice broke the silence gently. We honored her request. Ava folded the note carefully. Her fingers trembled slightly. She never told me. No, Margaret said softly. She wanted your choices to belong to you. The words settled deeply. For the first time all day, Ava understood the true inheritance her grandparents had left behind. Not money. Not influence. Freedom. Freedom to serve without recognition. Freedom to walk away if she wished. Freedom to decide what kind of person she wanted to become. Richard slowly stood from his chair. The movement drew everyone's attention. He looked directly at Ava. For a second he seemed unsure how to begin. Then he took a breath. Miss Richardson. The room fell silent once more. There is something I need to say. Richard Coleman stood motionless for a moment, as though weighing every word before allowing it to leave his mouth. The late afternoon sun painted the conference room in warm amber light. Shadows stretched across the polished table, touching the old documents, the faded photographs, and the wooden box that had quietly carried 4 decades of history into the room. Ava looked at him calmly. She felt no anger. The discoveries of the day had pushed those emotions aside. What remained was something simpler. Curiosity. Richard exhaled slowly. When you walked into the lobby this morning, I made assumptions. His voice was steady, but softer than it had been downstairs. I looked at your clothes. I looked at the box. I looked at what I expected to see instead of what was actually in front of me. Nobody interrupted. Margaret Ellis watched quietly from her chair. William Hartley remained still, his hands folded on the table. Richard continued. I have spent 23 years in banking. He glanced briefly toward the skyline beyond the windows. I told myself that experience taught me how to read people. A faint smile crossed his face. Today proved otherwise. Ava listened without speaking. Richard looked directly at her. The truth is, I never asked who you were. I decided who you were. The words settled heavily into the silence. He lowered his gaze for a second before continuing. And for that, I am deeply sorry. The room remained quiet. No dramatic reaction followed. No lecture. No confrontation. Just the steady hum of the building and the distant glow of the city beyond the glass. Ava thought about her grandmother. Eleanor would have listened exactly like this. Without interruption. Without trying to win. Richard slowly sat back down. I have been thinking about your grandfather all afternoon. He glanced toward the photograph again. A man had every reason to choose the larger offer. Every reason to think about himself first. His voice softened. Instead he thought about strangers he would never meet. Margaret nodded gently. That was who he was. Richard looked at Ava. And somehow, after everything that happened today, that is what I keep remembering. Ava rested her hand lightly on the folded note from her grandmother. The paper felt fragile beneath her fingertips. Yet the values it carried seemed stronger than anything else in the room. William Hartley leaned forward slightly. "Miss Richardson, there is no pressure for a decision today." Ava looked at him. "You mean the initiative?" William nodded. "Take all the time you need." Margaret smiled. "Your grandmother certainly would." A faint laugh moved through the room. Small, warm, human. For the first time all afternoon, the tension seemed to ease. Ava looked down at the proposal one more time. Scholarships, small business grants, community programs, opportunities for people who might otherwise be overlooked. She imagined her grandfather reading it. She imagined her grandmother quietly pretending she was not proud, while secretly clipping every newspaper article about students who succeeded because someone believed in them. The thought made her smile. William noticed. "What is it?" Ava looked around the room. At the documents. At the photographs. At the people who had spent months preparing for a promise made 40 years earlier. Then she answered honestly. "I think my grandparents would have cared much more about what happens next than what happened before." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Margaret's eyes brightened. "That," she said softly, "sounds exactly like a Richardson." The meeting ended quietly. No ceremony. No photographers. No dramatic announcement. Just people gathering old papers and carefully returning documents to a wooden box that had carried a promise across 4 decades. Ava helped Margaret place the final photograph inside. James Richardson's smile disappeared beneath the lid. Then the brass lock clicked shut once more. For a moment nobody moved. The golden light outside the windows had deepened into the rich amber of early evening. Charlotte stretched beneath them, glowing softly as office lights flickered on one building at a time. William Hartley walked with Ava toward the elevators. Richard Coleman followed a few steps behind. The atmosphere felt different now. Lighter. Honest. As they reached the executive reception area, Margaret stopped and embraced Ava gently. "Your grandmother would be proud of you." Ava smiled. "She would probably tell everyone to stop making such a fuss." Margaret laughed quietly. That too. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. Ava stepped inside carrying the wooden box. William extended his hand. She shook it. "Whatever you decide about the initiative," he said, "the offer remains open." Ava nodded. "Thank you." Richard hesitated until the last possible second. Then he stepped forward. "Miss Richardson." Ava looked at him. The same man who had stood in the lobby that morning now seemed years older somehow. Not weaker. Just more thoughtful. "Thank you for your grace today," he said quietly. Ava considered his words. Then she glanced at the wooden box in her hands. "I think my grandparents would have wanted people to learn from mistakes instead of living inside them." Richard nodded slowly. The elevator doors closed before either of them could say more. As the car descended through the building, Ava watched the floor numbers count downward. 31, 29, 26. The city lights reflected softly in the brushed steel walls. She thought about the day. About hidden letters. Forgotten promises. And a grandfather who chose compassion when nobody would have blamed him for choosing profit instead. When the elevator reached the lobby, the atmosphere had completely changed. Employees greeted her respectfully. Customers glanced up with curiosity but not judgment. Yet none of that mattered much anymore. Ava crossed the marble floor at an unhurried pace. Near the entrance she paused beside the wall of historical photographs. The same portrait had caught her attention earlier. Nathaniel Brooks stood proudly outside the original headquarters. But now Ava noticed something she had missed before. At the far edge of the frame, partially cropped from view, stood another man. Younger. Quiet. Easy to overlook. James Richardson. Ava smiled. Felt fitting. Her grandfather had never needed to stand at the center of the picture. He had changed the story anyway. Outside, the evening air felt cool against her face. Traffic moved steadily along the streets. A bus rolled past. Somewhere a distant siren echoed through the city. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Ava walked toward her aging Honda parked 3 blocks away. The wooden box rested comfortably beneath her arm. She stopped once before reaching the car and looked back at the bank's illuminated tower rising against the darkening sky. 40 years earlier, her grandparents had helped save a building. But that was not the legacy that mattered. The real legacy was something quieter. A belief that people deserve dignity whether anyone was watching or not. Ava opened the car door and carefully placed the box on the passenger seat. Then she sat behind the wheel and rested her hands there for a moment. The city lights shimmered across the windshield. A small smile touched her face. She did not know exactly what would happen next. But she knew one thing with certainty. Her grandparents had not changed the world through power. They changed it through character. And somehow, after all these years, that gift was still growing.